I'm Pam Markley. I'm the care pastor at Crosspointe Church, and I have with me Rachel Mathew, who is an LCSW and a licensed therapist. And Rachel, you can introduce yourself way better than I can. Would you mind telling folks why we're here talking today?
I've been in the field for about 35 years, working with adults, children, families in different arenas. But my first job was working with children who were diagnosed with cancer. And I worked with the children and their families. And I guess I was introduced in a big way to death and loss and grief and changes and shifts in the family. And that piece has really drawn me to grief work right through my career. And so I am a grief specialist, and it is truly a privilege to walk with people when they're going through one of their hardest times.
As we talk about grief, for the purpose of these videos, we're talking about it specifically in children. How does grief, how is it different in a child versus an adult?
It's a little more complex simply because they don't have the language that we adults have. I would say for the most part, the language that. But children, I think it manifests mostly in their behavior. And so the depth is there, meaning they feel intensely and they feel deeply about whatever their loss is. But you'll find with, say, toddlers, they don't have a sense of what death is or what loss is, but they know they recognize there's a shift and a change.
Right.
Something's different.
Right.
And so they might be more clingy, for example, right? Or they might, a school-going child just might get more withdrawn, or a teenager. So you see it more in their behavior than them actually verbalizing their sadness.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. As a parent, my kids were little. When I had to tell them about grief, and it was about their dad passing, and it was very challenging because you don't want to tell your kids negative things. You don't want to tell them bad news. You don't want to hurt them or bring hurt into their world, because we just want to protect our children so much. Talk to me about how we can do different for our children, how we can prepare them. Guide me through the process of parenting well in life on a normal day, so that when grief happens, we can be supportive of our kids.
We're not very comfortable talking about uncomfortable things, right? Rather sweep it under the rug. We'll get to it later. So talking about whether it's death or any kind of loss, I think our children are not really prepared. And so I see it as our role as parents not to just protect, which is our instinct, but how do we prepare our children? And so let me give you an example. So Joey has a goldfish.
Yeah.
Okay. And goldfish dies.
Right.
Okay. Before you know it, the parents have replaced the goldfish. Okay. So now we're going on the fifth goldfish, and Joey has no idea that it isn't the first goldfish. Right. So when something more significant happens in terms of a loss or a death of a grandparent, it comes as a bit of a shock.
Right, because they've not lost anything as far as lost.
Exactly. Okay. So I think instead, if the first time around that goldfish died, if Joey's parents had sat with Joey and said, "This is really painful. I know that you were very attached to the goldfish, but how about we say, come up with a ritual or some way to say goodbye." The solution to all of this is not, again, to go and say, "We'll go to the store tomorrow and buy another fish." To give them permission to sit in that sadness. Right. Yeah. Because I think it's not just the child. The adults are uncomfortable with sitting in that sadness, right? So how do we make it all right for the child?
How do we normalize that people pass or grief happens.
And I think I would say also if a parent or a grandparent is sick, it's okay to take the child to the hospital. Yeah. It's okay for the child to attend the funeral if that person passes away, because it's really important for the child to be able to say goodbye. There's a beautiful French movie called Ponette, and it's about a 4-year-old girl who is in a car accident with her mother. Okay. And her mother sadly passes away, and Ponette has a fractured arm. And the father is very upset and distraught, and I think sees the child as, remembers that the mother passed away in that accident, and so sends her off to live with her aunt, and then she and her cousins are sent off to boarding school. And and she's taunted in school because she's the motherless child. But she has no conversation about where her mother is, what happened, what is all this about death and grieving. And she decides to be an angel. That's the only way she can see her mother. In her mind, she creates. So I think we have no idea in their little minds what is going on. Right. So if we can help them with the information, right, they would be better prepared.
So we're talking specifically about, very generally about grief today. And most of our examples so far have been the loss of a loved one.
Sure.
But there are a lot of ways that children experience grief. Can you touch on a couple other ways that people may not readily think, they're going to elicit a grief response?
Sure. I think losses are different for children, okay, and as opposed to what adults consider a big loss, right, or that it warrants grieving over. Okay. But I think, a child practicing the entire summer to make it into the baseball team, and then he doesn't make it, how is he feeling about that? Or your daughter's best friend, she's made all these plans over the summer, right? I'm going to do this with her, and I'm going to do this. And the last week of school, she announces that she is leaving. Right? And she's moving to another state. So there's the loss of a friendship, and there's the loss of all these summer plans. And I think to be able to validate those feelings instead of saying, you'll make other friends.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't worry, and we'll go and do fun things over the summer. Well, she doesn't want to do fun things with you. She wants to do fun things with her.
Yeah. I never thought of that. Our family, we moved half a mile down the road a year and a half ago, which meant changing schools. Mm-hmm. And my daughter in particular, she was devastated. But as an adult, I'm like, it's half a mile. We're still the same church. We're still in the same community. The kids in the neighborhood cross over. Mm-hmm. But she was devastated. And I, as adults, it's easy to be like, oh, you'll be fine. But she doesn't have the framework that I do to realize that, yes, you will still see all those people. And she's come through it. But I didn't even consider that aspect of moving. I was more concerned about unpacking boxes.
I'm going to touch upon something called ambiguous loss. Yeah. Ambiguous loss is a loss where there's no resolution. Okay. So there are two types of ambiguous loss. There's physically present, but psychologically absent, and physically absent, but psychologically present. So let me give you some examples. So physically present, but psychologically absent would be a grandparent who is developing dementia. Okay, so you do all these fun activities with grandpa, and suddenly grandpa doesn't even recognize you. Or it is a parent suffering from chronic illness, right? So suddenly that parent cannot do all the things, or a sibling who's just been diagnosed with a disease and needs to be in and out of treatment. So you are buddies with your sibling, you do all the things together, and suddenly that sibling can't do the stuff with you.
Would you put a new baby in that category?
Definitely. Okay. Yeah.
Would it distract parents from
Exactly. And it's celebration for everybody, but not for this child. This child, it's a loss, right? And so I think that is important to remember, that they're not feeling the same feelings as you. And you want them to be happy that they've got a new sibling, but they're thinking of all the things that they've lost.
Right. So the other ambiguous grief is physically absent, psychologically present.
Yeah.
What are some examples of those?
Say there's a missing person in the family. Okay. So all the attention is about finding that person and, of course, the loss of that person. But there's no resolution because you have no idea. You're just waiting. So you're in this space of limbo, right? But if there are other children in the family, what are they experiencing? Okay. Also, immigrant children. You know, they're in a new country. They're away from everything that is familiar. Extended family. They're learning new language, right? Culturally, it's a shock.
Yeah,
that in itself is a shock. And adjusting to a new environment, all these are losses. And who are they? What is their identity? Right? Will I make a friend? Will people look at me differently? So I think that would be another example.
And would you put like military families? Because
definitely,
you know, families, when you have a family member in the military, they're deployed, and the hope is they're going to come home. Sometimes that doesn't happen, which becomes a different type of loss all itself. But when you're living with a parent deployed to another part of the country, there's different levels of that.
And they might miss out on major events, right? Your graduation or holidays.
How do you help them process it? How are they processing it? How are they processing the loss? And how do we know that they're processing it?
Well, I would say, obviously, it's dependent on age and development. Like I said, the toddler is probably going to be more clingy, some regressive behavior. With a school-going child, there's magical thinking in the sense that they feel they've done something to cause this. So not only are they dealing with the loss, but they're also dealing with, am I the reason something happened to their pet? You know, did I lock the door? Was I the one who forgot to, close the door behind me, and the dog ran across the road and got hit? So there are all these things they're also dealing with. And I think with older children, sometimes it can be a relief, but they can't really say it. If it was a parent that was, suffering from a disease for a very long time, that is also hard on the family. And then children I think teenagers especially, tend to be withdrawn, and then they kind of go into their own shell.
Right. I would love it if you could touch a little bit on how grief isn't just a short period of time, but also how kids grieve differently depending on when the loss happened. Like, an example is, when my husband passed away, my kids were 4, 3, and 7 months old. And so grief for my 4-year-old is very different than my 7-month-old. And now that they're 12 and 8, we're seeing it in different ways. How do we as parents walk them through? Because grief is a journey. It's not over in a year or when the funeral ends. How do we walk them through that?
Well, I think the first thing is to honor their feelings, right? At every stage. To listen. Just be really present. And that their feelings are not going to coincide with yours, right? And I think just having open communication, I think that is a way of letting them know that their feelings are real. You're validating their feelings. And the more honest you are with them, they'll also open up. Now, it's possible that they won't open up, but that's okay. We tend, they take their time over sharing their sadness. And and I think they process it in different ways, right? Like my son's good friend's mother passed away of cancer. And I went into that whole mode of, what is there that we can do?
Right.
And have you called him? And he was like a little, in the evening we're going to play video games. And I was like, it was a bit of a shock to me. Like, mom passed away in the morning and by evening you're playing video games. Right. But I didn't say anything. And later, after they had all gathered, their friends had played video games, I said, how's he doing? He's like, yeah, it's okay. We kind of told him we're here for him. And then we just got back to playing.
Yeah.
But I think it was a lesson for me that as a 14-year-old, they communicated with their friend that they're there for him. They made time to play video games that evening, even if they had other things that were going on.
They were there for him.
They were there for him.
My youngest, one of the things that is intriguing to me is he didn't know life with his dad. But now, 8 years later, which, we talk about the person's missing forever, but 8 years later, we're seeing his grief come out different than it did for his siblings. Is it ever over? Like, do they ever stop grieving?
I don't think anyone ever stops grieving, whether it's an adult or a child. I think we create life, we create our life around that grief or around that void.
Yeah.
Okay. It is critical to find ways to find meaning again.
Yeah.
That's really important. But there's no timeline. And I think I hear that a lot. Well, it's 3 months since, so-and-so passed away and, she hasn't come out. And, each person grieves. The journey is so unique. Right. And you have 3 children. I'm sure each one has processed it differently. Yes. And so I think for parents also to be patient. And that's hard. We live in a world where everything has to be immediate, has to be done, has to be finished.
Right.
That's the world we live in. Right. And I'm like, this is one area you just can't hurry up.
Last question. What are some signs that our children are grieving?
I think when it comes to teenagers, would be if they are more withdrawn than usual, I think every parent obviously knows their child pretty well. So I think if you see anything that is different and radically different from their normal behavior, I would say be extra observant and notice, and if needs be, get professional help. I think if they have lost interest in something they're really passionate about, I don't want to go out and play ball with, go for my basketball practice, or I don't want to go and practice the instrument which she normally practices for an hour every day, or just wanting to be social, just wanting to go and hang out with children. Of course, there are extreme cases of children self-harming, so I think that would be something to be on the lookout. Just be mindful of that. Have they stopped eating? I think, making sure that your children are eating, their meals, hydrating, are they taking care of their personal hygiene, a day or two, maybe a week that they're just not lounging in their pajamas, they're just not able to get going. That's normal, but I think after that, what I would say routine is so important. So getting them back into the routine, and if they're fighting that, then I would be a little concerned.
Are there any other things in the smaller children? You touched base on teenagers, but on young children that we might...
I think you would see aggressive behavior sometimes, like biting, with toddlers, wanting their passy again, even though they've outgrown it, because it's very soothing for them. I think just being... I think a lot of kids develop social anxiety just because, especially if they've lost someone really close to them, they're now worried, what's going to happen to me if something happens to my other parent or my grandmother who they live with, That's for them, they really need that adult in their life. I think it's really important when we talk about preparing is also in terms of introducing other adults in our children's lives that we really find trustworthy. share our values and things like that. So when something, it may not just be a death, but any kind of crisis that leads to a shift in what's normal. I think it's wonderful that you have people that you can count on, but more importantly, that your children are comfortable and they can count on.